Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Adam Dorsey, a psychologist in Silicon Valley, and I am the host of Super Psyched, a podcast dedicated to supercharging your life. Each episode contains fun, high-quality interviews with experts looking at psychology from all angles. Super Psyched is your tool to get more of what you want in your life and less of what you don't. Imagine you've just come back from running your first half marathon. Imagine further that you're not a natural runner and the half marathon took you months of preparation. You feel excited to share the news on social media when, lo and behold, you see a post of a friend that reads, "I just finished my third Ironman triathlon." You think, damn, I ran 13.1 miles. And my friend swam a few miles, biked 100, and then ran 26.2, and for the third time. Suddenly, you feel bad about something that had felt so good just minutes before. You've engaged in social comparison, and that's something all humans do. How can we enjoy who we are, what we do, and so much of what life has to offer when our brains go into social comparison and make us feel worse? Fortunately, I know just the guy to ask. Dr. Ronald Siegel is a professor at Harvard Medical School, a psychologist, and best-selling author who just wrote a must-read book called The Extraordinary Gift of Being Ordinary: Finding Happiness Right Where You Are. Ron explains how our brains can both harm us or serve us, and how to regain control over the default programming in very user-friendly ways. The book has been widely loved by luminaries in the field of psychology and readers of all walks of life. So listen in as Ron unpacks how to override the brain's tendency toward social comparison. Dr. Ronald Siegel, who has asked me to call him Ron, welcome to Super Psyched.
Thank you for having me.
I'm so glad to meet you, and I've been a fan of your writing for some time. I took great joy in reading your book because it's such a prescription for the time. In an age of FOMO and social comparison at an all-time high, especially with social media and with new wealth, particularly where I am in Silicon Valley, where it's really, really apparent. Your idea of coming up with a book describing the extraordinariness of appreciating that which is ordinary in ourselves is such a timely book. And you begin it with the funniest quote ever. I won't quote it verbatim, but to paraphrase, you basically quoted a friend who said, "Nobody's going to read this book. Don't write it because nobody wants to be ordinary." And yet here you are 377 pages later, having invested quite an opportunity cost into the writing and your time, and you wrote it beautifully. So clearly you doubled down in spite of said advice. And I'm wondering, what drove you to write this, and what are you hoping people will come to understand?
Well, to be perfectly honest, I wrote this as a self-treatment project because there I was in my 60s, having spent well nigh 4 decades involved in studying and doing psychotherapy, and 4 decades in contemplative practices, particularly Buddhist meditation practices, that are designed to have us be less preoccupied with ourselves, and psychotherapy, which we might imagine would result in having something like a secure, coherent sense of self. And I realized that my self-evaluations were going up and down hourly, sometimes by the minute, sometimes just by the day or the week. But I was constantly fluctuating in terms of how good I felt about myself. You know, I would have a good session with a client or patient, and I'd think, yeah, I'm a really competent psychologist. All these years of experience are really paying off. I'd have a session that goes poorly, and I think, I know I should have been a mechanical engineer. Really not my calling. And this would continue to happen to me. And I would find myself, because, I'm on the teaching circuit, how many people showed up for the workshop? How many people were interested in me versus my colleague? I'm thinking, what's with this? Why is this going on after all of these years? my first hypothesis was, well, some of the stuff that went wrong in basically junior high, I've just never worked through, and I've never gotten over the trauma of being picked last for teams. But then I thought, maybe it's not just because of my inadequacy. Maybe there's something more universal to this, because after all, virtually all my clients are struggling with some variation on this, going up and down and struggling to try to stay on top of, struggling to try to feel good about themselves. So I thought, let me dig into this. What does the world's wisdom traditions, what does science, what do psychotherapeutic traditions have to offer about this? And can I identify the key ingredients for stepping off this roller coaster and instead being able to actually have some freedom in life, actually enjoy what we're doing with more engagement, actually connect to others instead of seeing them as a competition? So that's what set me on the project. And I got to say, it's worked. Now, not 100%, because as we'll talk about, the forces that trap us in social comparison and self-evaluation, they're strong. And many of them are quite hardwired in the brain. And as you're mentioning, in our times, my gosh, the culture reinforces this in so many different ways. So not like complete freedom, but lighter, a little less preoccupied.
So I must ask, I imagine when you were writing this book, there was a blueprint for the book. You had kind of a sense of how it would flow. And yet what emerged from the pen, I imagine you typed it, but I'm going to say the proverbial pen, surprised you at times. And maybe the content was richer and even more self-instructive as you were typing something, where you might have even written a phrase or a sentence or a paragraph and thought, hey, that's good. Did you ever have that experience when you were writing the book?
I certainly had that experience. And even before putting pen to paper, proverbially, I did a lot of research for the book. And that was very illuminating. I really dug into what's known about how the brain formed and, why is this so pervasive across so many cultures? Why is everybody always comparing themselves to others and striving so to hang on to feeling good about ourselves and trying so hard to avoid feeling bad about ourselves? And then I started really doing a kind of systematic survey of all the different ways we get hooked. And my gosh, was that horrifying and humbling, because there are so many different ways that we get hooked. And then I started really looking at what are the antidotes. So it was actually the research phase of the book that was most surprising to me, initially in a horrifying way, just noticing how pervasive concerns about this are, but then in a liberating way, that it's really possible to put our attention on other things and find much more sustainable paths to well-being.
That's amazing. So let's talk about the smoking guns, but in this case, the smoking hooks, to use your parlance. What are the most common hooks that really get us thinking poorly in our own self-assessment?
It's not even the thinking poorly that's the problem. It's the being attached to the self-assessment that I believe is the problem, or that's what I've come to. And the question is, why are we so hooked by this? And I put a lot of stake in our evolutionary history. I remember going around on a so-called safari in Africa. One of my daughters was doing a year studying environmental matters in South Africa. So we went to visit her and had the privilege of riding around in a Jeep with a naturalist and looking at all different species and learning about their behavior. And this pattern showed up over and over and over. You'd see this dominant male surrounded by basically a harem of reproductively promising females. And then over in the next field somewhere, there was a group of slightly younger men doing the species-specific equivalent of playing basketball, trying to hone their skills to be able to become dominant. And the issue was, what's up with this? Why would it matter to be dominant in this way? Why are so many species organizing themselves in this way? And why is there such a gravitational pull to be around the dominant male, either to be friends with or to have children with the dominant males? What's going on here? And as it turns out, evolutionary biologists have pretty much confirmed that while there are some exceptions, by and large, those who are dominant have greater access to resources. They have a greater chance of passing their DNA on to the next generation, and they have a better chance of being able to take care of their kids who are carrying that DNA. So we might imagine that there were happy hominids or members of other species that weren't hooked on this, that were hanging around, holding hands or touching hooves and singing Kumbaya and not competing. But they typically weren't the ones who got to reproduce as much. The ones who got to reproduce more were the ones who were into this. So we've all got genes for this. There are crickets that if you put them in a box, inside of a few seconds will organize themselves into a dominance hierarchy. If you take children at age 4 and put them in little groups, they will organize themselves into what are called transitive dominance hierarchies. The transitive idea in math that if A is greater than B and B is greater than C, then A is greater than C. Well, if Sally is able to dominate Jose and Jose is able to dominate Susie, Sally knows she can dominate Susie. Right. And Susie knows she can be dominated by Sally. And they figure this out inside of a few moments. I could go on at length. I'll stop there
for sure.
Example. Adult humans, just listening to the voices of other people that they're going to be put in a group project with can tell you who's going to be dominant in the project. And indeed, it works out that way.
That is absolutely amazing. We are somehow genetically predisposed to listen for cues, to observe cues, to establish pecking order. And you noted in other books as well that you've written that this is not species specific, that fish do this, birds do this. And you even mentioned in a Robert Sapolsky interview that it's really bad to be a low status baboon. Not only does it fare poorly for the future prospects of your genes, but it also can turn into other physiological problems, such as, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, gastrointestinal and others. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Well, because it stresses us out, constantly striving to do something about our position. And this is our fate as humans. I think the interesting thing about these kind of dominance hierarchies and social comparison is exactly how it shows up in the human psyche. Because the way it shows up in the human psyche is with concern over self-esteem.
Right.
It shows up in the sense of, am I attractive enough? Am I smart enough? Am I being paid enough for what I do? Am I a good enough person? Am I kind enough? The list is quite long, but it's all of these different ways that we evaluate ourselves and think, am I doing well enough or not? And when we feel we're doing well, we feel so good. We get this good feeling inside. When we feel like we're coming up short, the horrible collapse. And then we strive to build ourselves up again.
And it seems that there's a cluster of predictors that allow us to recognize where we fall in the hierarchy. And yet, one of the things that you're saying is that, wow, now that we're at this place where we can actually recognize these trends, maybe we override our programming and take a look and say, hey, you know what? I'd like to have a good life. And in spite of the fact that I may not be the most dominant person in the room, I'm still good. I'm still worthy, and I'm still probably marriageable, and a host of other great things. I could still be a great dad, a great little league coach, and probably great in my chosen profession. It's just that there's something so primal about the proverbial jock who is kind of the top of the heap. And I remember, oh my gosh, Ron, you cannot make this up. It was the day before 9th grade for me. And I was meeting with a former high school principal for a motivational talk. And let me just tell you, this motivational talk would have been hilarious on YouTube as like how not to give a motivational talk. And simply when I walked in, he just said, young man, tell me, are you at the top of the heap or at the bottom of the heap? And I just looked at him and I was just like, I neither. But I guess if I'm not at the top, it must mean forced choice question. I guess I'm at the bottom. And the echoes of that resonated throughout my high school years. I never forgot that interaction that you're either at the top or you're at the bottom. And you said that some of the ghosts of your junior high school past were summoning you to write this book. And it's amazing how perhaps well-intentioned grown-up advice can go sideways when it's directed in this manner, corroborating what we instinctively know about biology and evolution and our status in the pecking order.
Yeah. I mean, one of the problems is that because winning or doing well, we're describing it in a little bit archetypally or traditionally male-oriented way. You know, this can show up in terms of, do I have friends? Do people think I'm a good person? Am I generous enough? Am I kind enough? There are many, many ways in which, many dimensions on which we wind up evaluating ourselves and either feeling good about ourselves or not. One of the things that happens is when we feel good about ourselves, in that moment, we're free from, and it wipes out all of the painful trauma of failures. In other words, if I'm, in this conversation with you and I start to feel, hey, this is going well. I'm sounding like I have something useful to add. I'm sounding like I'm an intelligent.
Right.
If I start in with those kinds of evaluative judgments, for a little while, the pain of being picked last for the team is gone. For a little while, the pain of having blown it in my last session with a client is gone. For a little while, the fact that I'm aging and my body's going to fall apart is gone. So there's this curious way that we're wired that when we have a self-esteem boost, all of our problems are solved for a few moments and it feels really good. And when we have a self-esteem crash, when we feel like we failed, we've been inadequate, we've been a bad person, people don't love us, we haven't been a good friend, I've been a bad husband, I'm not a good dad. When one of those moments happens, those are so painful that at least I desperately want to fix it. And what's the easiest way to fix it? Win at something, have some success, have somebody like me. So the fact that there's such a big difference between how lousy it feels to feel bad about ourselves and how good it feels to feel good about ourselves, well, that sets us up for addiction. Whenever there's a big gap between how one thing feels and another thing feels, we get addicted to the other thing. Take cocaine as an example, right? I don't have a lot of experience with it, but my understanding is, that, when people get high on cocaine, they feel really, really good. But when it wears off, they feel really, really bad. And what does that drive them to do? Let's have some more cocaine. When we have a self-esteem boost, they study this in the lab. When you have a like on Instagram or Facebook, there is activation in the nucleus accumbens, the reward center of the brain, which is the exact same reward center, which lights up when we are on cocaine. It's the exact same reward center that lights up when we have a gambling win, when somebody we find attractive is attracted to us. It's this dopamine squirt in the nucleus accumbens that feels so good and makes all the pain of the past go away. So we get highly addicted to this easily.
You mentioned something that was so important. You brought in a Lewis Carroll quote from Alice in Wonderland, where the caterpillar's asking, "Who are you?" And she says, "I must have been something like 7 things since this morning." And what we do is we get so invested in part of our identity and neglect to see that we are so many things. We are a multiplicity at any given moment. And I'm wondering, if you were to be a tailor and trying to have us stand in front of multiple mirrors, what are some of the parts that we might tend to overlook that require some appreciation?
I think that the parts that we tend to overlook are the ones that have been injured. The way I felt about myself getting picked last for a team as a kid, that part I overlook a lot, right? I don't want to have a lot of contact with that.
I don't want to remember it.
Because I don't want to remember it. I don't want to remember feeling like the little kid who's not making the grade. That was super painful. So I think the parts we overlook most are the ones that have been painful to us, that we kind of push out of awareness, we try to hide from. And in fact, we seek these good feelings about ourselves in large part to protect us from those, which is one of the reasons why the pathway through this, if we're going to get free from this, we have to be willing to do some work on our past traumas. And these don't have to be big T traumas of horrible things that have happened in our life, but I have to find a way to relate to the little Ronnie who felt really, really hurt and hopeless and helpless in those moments, and to have some kind of caring way to hold him if I'm going to step off the self-esteem roller coaster. Because I'm only going to be able to give up the constant stressful striving to be on top or even just good enough if I'm not afraid so much anymore of the hurt feelings that come from the moments where we failed or where we felt rejected or we felt people didn't love us or that we somehow weren't good enough. So the pathway through this is actually attending to those parts that we tend to neglect.
I love that so much. So you've got little Ronnie, I've got little Adam. When I was 28 years old, I was in a men's process group. We talked about real things. Of course, we talked about sports and tech and things like that as well, but we talked about how our hearts were doing, just those things called feelings that men are often a little bit wary of discussing. And I remember that I had done so much in reaction to second grade Adam. I changed schools twice, once in ninth grade, as I mentioned, and once in second grade. So I actually transferred from a private school where athletics were not a part of the curriculum at all. So I go into second grade and I'm positively the worst in the class. And I practiced by myself like Rocky Balboa every day to become good. The next year I did much better. But so much of my life was in reaction to severing ties with that version of myself. And I actually vilified little Adam in second grade. And only when I was 28, when I felt strong enough, was I even willing to enter into some form of recognition of who he was, let alone a dialogue with that part of myself. And I'm wondering, how might we begin a better, more adult relationship with our littler parts that were so badly hurt?
My friend and colleague, Dick Schwartz, who developed internal family systems and who you've interviewed, he calls these particular parts exiles because they are exiled. We don't want to have them in our lives. And we've got all these other parts that he calls protector parts that are there to make sure that we don't catch wind and nobody else sees the exiles. So I think the first thing that we need to do is to be kind to ourselves and understand why, of course, we've hidden that part away. Of course we did. That was so painful. We felt so like we didn't have the resources we needed. And we discovered that these protective parts, being competent at something else, sorry, but you starting this podcast series, not that it's not a good offering for the world, but I'm going to speculate that at least one component of this is, hey, it makes you feel good about yourself to be successful.
Totally. And it's my own battle to not be ordinary, of course. It's multiple things, as Alice was throughout the day. It's a host of things.
Yes, exactly. And we don't want to reduce this. And this isn't a polemic against achievement or the things in the world, but it is an invitation to look at the way in which we use these other parts to protect ourselves from the hurt, vulnerable parts of ourselves. And that maybe even though at the time when we were little, it was too much and we couldn't bear it, maybe we can bear it now. And maybe we don't need as much protection as we once did. And we can experiment with relaxing it. Because the interesting thing is when we're able to connect with our vulnerability, it feels good. It feels like a relief. And at least what I find personally, and, working on this book is when I have a failure experience or disappointment or, something doesn't go the way I want it to go, if I can find a way to connect with all of the hurt feelings associated with that and seeing how those hurt feelings resonate with the pain in the past, and I can develop some form of self-compassion, some way to hold little Ronnie, if you will, I just feel so much better. And guess what? Suddenly I don't need the win anymore. Suddenly I don't need the other person to like me or validate me or think I'm wonderful. It actually does free me from the roller coaster, and I can experience that. And that then becomes motivation to keep making friends with these parts of us that aren't so shiny, aren't so fancy, are really quite ordinary. And interestingly, that connect us to everyone else because everyone else has these inner experiences. It's so interesting to me that the things we're most ashamed of and the things that we think separate us from the human family are exactly the things that everybody else is struggling with. Like your little Adam, my little Ronnie.
Absolutely.
This actually have in common, even though neither of us wants it to be seen very much.
Yeah. And if anybody doubts that, you can just take a look at the mega response to Brene Brown's talk on her own vulnerability. You and I are both fans of the axiom, what we resist persists. And if you can't feel it, you can't heal it. And I think about boardroom arguments and how everyone in there on some level may be like a pendulum trying to compensate for their inner child that was injured so that they can win this battle, have a corrective experience and feel good about themselves for a moment and get that cocaine hit.
Right.
And then we revert to baseline and maybe don't feel so great about ourselves. One thing I neglected to mention is not only was I the worst athlete in the class in second grade, but I presented with a high IQ, except for the fact that I had learning disabilities that they couldn't identify at the time. I had dyslexia and ADHD of the inattentive type. So I was a problem to no one except myself. I was just staring out the window like Hans Christian Andersen, wondering, what was going on outside in the trees. And so I was put in special ed. If you remember Welcome Back, Kotter, that was my peer group. So my sense of self was really bad. And you mentioned self-esteem, which at that time was the gold standard of what we were trying to help children to cultivate. And you disabuse the reader of the power of self-esteem as a measure. And in fact, have basically helped us, peel back the curtain to see that, in fact, that's the wrong target. Can you speak a little bit about self-esteem and how that might be a misguided target?
Yeah, absolutely. There was a task force in California in the 1980s that was developed to help boost the self-esteem of kids in California. And the logic was, kids who are in gangs or kids who are getting pregnant at a very young age and aren't able to take care of their kids don't feel very good about themselves. So maybe if we could help them to feel better about themselves, that would be something of a social vaccine and it would cure all these ills. And in fact, the argument for funding this was, and they'll be more productive citizens, they'll pay more taxes, and this will actually be revenue neutral. This was actually the argument that was put forth, or revenue positive. So worth investing in.
Sure.
Well, it didn't work. It didn't work at all because they got the causal arrow wrong. It is true that if we're doing well in school, we have friends, we're more or less following the rules, we have a loving family, we do tend to feel better about ourselves than when everything's going wrong. That is true. However, they got the causal arrow wrong. Just trying to make you feel better about yourself is not going to make you have friends, do well in school, have a loving family, and the like. In fact, as it turns out, people with higher self-esteem in general are more self-focused, are less empathic. They're not great people. And they also, interestingly, people with high self-esteem are actually on objective measures no better than people with low self-esteem. In other words, they're not smarter, they're not more attractive, they just think that they are. The alternative to self-esteem for kids is helping them to develop self-compassion. And if I can give you a sort of classical parenting vignette, it'll illustrate the difference.
I would love that.
Let's say your child comes home from school and they're really crestfallen because they really wanted to make the baseball team and they didn't make the cut. And if you're interested in supporting your child's self-esteem, you'll say, yes, but Juan, you made the basketball team in the fall. And in fact, you were one of the star players. And look at the way you won the Mathletes Award. You got to the regional championships and you won. You're such a smart kid. You're so talented. You're really okay. And maybe that would work to make Juan feel a little bit better about himself for a few minutes. However, it would also further hook him on the idea that the pathway to well-being is, I've got to be extraordinary. I've got to be on top. I've got to be a winner. If you wanted to help Juan develop self-compassion, you'd say, oh, sweetheart, I remember I was really into drama when I was your age and I didn't make the school play and I was devastated. I felt so bad. I felt so jealous of the kids who were in the play. It was really, really painful. For a few weeks, it was really, really hard. It is hard, isn't it? When we don't get what we want. Let me give you a hug, sweetheart. So what's the difference here? The difference is we're saying it's universal. We're all going to go up. We're all going to go down. We're going to win and lose. And I'm here connected with you, loving you. And my loving you is not contingent on you being a winner. And this is such a different message because we get so many messages that we're only going to be lovable if we're a winner. To come back to evolutionary history, in addition to it being more likely that we're going to pass our genes along if we're high ranking in the primate troop, if we're alone on the African savanna, that's a death sentence.
For sure.
And in fact, if we're alone, even as a baby in modern developed countries, it's a death sentence. We need somebody to love us and care for us developmentally in our own life. And historically, we needed it as well. So the feeling that people like me and want me or don't like me and don't want me Oh boy, is that intense. I mean, just think of what it feels like to be invited to the party or not invited to the party, to be in the in group or not to be in the in group, or to be attracted to somebody and have the person who we're starting to really like us back. Oh, all the problems are solved. Or reject us. Oh my God, we're devastated. So we're very strongly wired to care about whether we're going to be accepted or not in this way. And if the acceptance feels like it's contingent on being extraordinary, it's going to be rough. Because unless we live in Lake Wobegon, where, what is it? All of the women are strong, the men are good looking, and all of the children are above average. We're going to be below average half the time. And oh boy.
And as you're speaking, I think about three things. Pope Bronson wrote a book called Nurture Shock, and he said one of the worst things you can do to your child is tell them they're smart. Don't praise the intelligence, praise the effort, because effort is what drives success. And then I think about Carol Dweck's work out of Stanford on mindset and the fixed and the growth. And the growth mindset is I can learn this even if I'm not a natural, even if I'm going to suck for a while. And then, of course, I think about, my own trajectory and how this is dovetailed. The reason I speak a few foreign languages reasonably well is I was willing to suck for a period of time and recognize that it was temporary, kind of like Alice in Wonderland, that I'd been 7 things since this morning over the course of, say, a few years with regard to my relationship with the language. And I think that we have just so much evidence that our willingness to fail, our willingness to faceplant. And I always cry when I watch Rocky 1, when he basically said, I just want to go 15 rounds. I don't care if I win or lose. I just want to make it through the match. And I just burst into tears. It kills me every time, because that's what we're going for here. And in our desire to be loved by others and to have self-approval, the not willingness to fail, we have to have this secure attachment to that part of ourselves to recognize it's going to be okay if we fail.
That's absolutely one of the liabilities of pursuing self-esteem as a way to feel good about yourself, because I become phobic of any situation where I might fail, because that's the disaster, because this is the currency. Everything's about, am I a success or not? And if I fail, oh my God, I won't be able to bear that. If, however, I've been working on, it's okay, sweetheart, we all win and we all lose, and having some way to be able to give ourselves a hug and it be okay to be at the bottom of the heap for a while, well, then I'm free, because what's the worst thing that can happen? All right, I'm going to blow it again. I happen to know a fellow by the name of Rick Doblin, who founded and runs the MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. And many people know, if they've read Michael Pollan's book or whatever, that, oh my God, this has gone from being completely shut down, no research, to being now a remarkable phase 3 FDA studies and everything. Well, Rick is a big reason why this has happened. And he's been at it for some 30 years. And for the first 20 of them, it was just faceplant after faceplant after faceplant. And I asked him, I said, how did you do it? My God, I give up enterprises after the first faceplant. I'm afraid of these feelings. He said, I just realized at a certain point that I didn't die from it. You could just get up and try it again. What the heck? The worst thing that's going to happen is it's going to fail again. And, to have that kind of freedom, but to have that freedom, we really do have to shift our whole orientation from how am I going to feel good about myself to how am I going to do things in the world that are connected to my values. The other thing that's really critical here is the role of safe social connection as a pathway out of this. When we're with a good friend, and I'm talking to my friend and I'm being honest and I'm talking about my frailties and talking about my desires and really being honest. In those moments, all this self-evaluative stuff is kind of less important, because I feel like I'm part of a we, right? It's the two of us are, they're sharing their experience, and the whole sense of self shifts from how's Ron doing to we're here together, we're connected. And the power of connection to help defuse these preoccupations is huge. When I'm talking to clients or patients about this, and they're about to meet the in-laws for the first time or go on the big job interview, my suggestion is try to make a connection, not an impression.
Yes.
We always go into these situations thinking, how am I going to show them that I'm basically extraordinary, that I'm special, that I'm worthwhile, that you should pick me, not the other one, that you should be happy that I'm going to be your new son-in-law or daughter-in-law. What if instead you tried to just get to know this person? What if we actually favored connection over impressing people? And it changes the experience radically. And it really does help us to get off of this kind of roller coaster.
You know, it's interesting because here I am talking to Dr. Ronald Siegel, whose work I've appreciated for so long. And of course, there's a part of me that wants to impress you. Oh boy, I hope after this interview, he thinks I'm smart and says, that was something else. He was really different. And of course that's happening. And then when I let go of that voice and just connect with you, Ron, the person, and enjoy what's coming out of your mouth, it's so much better to connect than to impress. Yeah. I don't need to play the guitar while juggling and tap dancing at the same time and say, look at what an incredible circus animal I am.
No, it's wonderful. And I'm so glad you're pointing this out because we feel it, right? It's visceral, how different it feels to make the shift to like, okay, let's just like connect here and explore this. And I find this in my work all the time because I do a lot of teaching, and the difference between when I'm teaching and most of the energy is into how am I doing? Are they liking me? Do they think I'm smart? Do they think I'm offering something useful? Are they going to recommend me to their friends? Are they going to read my book? When I'm on that level, it's such a different experience than playing with the ideas, seeing what comes up, enjoying the other person's ideas and actually listening to the other person's ideas. It's a whole other enterprise. And we can feel this in anything we do. To what extent are we doing it basically with the self-evaluative narrative being central? And to what degree are we simply engaged in the process and connected to the other people involved in the process?
Absolutely. And so when we kind of steer away from connection and try to make an impression, I think about how this manifests in my own life. My inner caveman is still going out hunting and wanting to bring home to my wife, like, look at this huge kill I brought home. Absolutely. Isn't this amazing? So that's at work for you as well, I'm sure.
Oh, absolutely. Look, one of the humbling things about this, I got into this project somewhat embarrassed that after decades of work, these things were still so prevalent in my mind. Getting into the project has certainly not made me think I'm free of it by any means. I see it everywhere. And, one of the offerings in the book is to use mindfulness practice to just observe every single time we get hooked and every time our feeling about ourselves goes up or down. And, oh my, this happens a lot if we're attentive to it. And it's just built in. It's just hardwired. So the way I relate to it, that is similar to my attraction to fat and sugar. All of us have something of an attraction to fat and sugar because in prehistoric times, that was associated with nutrition. So we love donuts. Now, donuts are not particularly associated with nutrition now anymore, but we can find ourselves liking it. That's not going to go away. I'm never going to, as long as I'm alive, I think I'm going to have an interest in donuts. However, gradually, I come to learn that mostly eating donuts doesn't work out that well. I don't think I'm ever going to no longer care about whether you're liking me right now or the audience is liking me right now or whether I'm sounding good to me or not. I don't think that's going to go away. But I can come to realize that I don't need to mostly have that be the focus. I don't need to mostly be going for the donuts. I can have a more balanced diet that includes donuts. And that's what my goal is here. It is easier when we have social support for giving this up than when we're getting thousands and thousands of societal messages that this is what matters. Social media gets blamed for a lot of things. I think we need to blame it for this. When we're looking on social media and you're looking at Instagram or Facebook or something, and what do we see? How many posts do we see that say, woke up this morning, had the runs again, I think I'm going to get a bad performance review at work, and my girlfriend's looking to dump me.
Right.
No, it's like at this fantastic party with fantastic people doing fantastic things that you're not doing. That's what people post, these curated visions of these wonderful lives. If we were countries, nation states, it would be as though we're reading through our own crime and poverty statistics and looking at other countries' travel brochures. That's the world we now marinate in. And we see from, psychologists love to create fake social media laboratory experiments where they can control likes, they can control followers, they can control all that stuff because they make it all up. And every time we feel like we're special, they like us, we're good, there go the dopamine hits. We start to feel great about ourselves. And every time the opposite happens, we feel terrible about ourselves. So, remember our experience of, let's say, high school. Could you imagine what it's like for these poor kids now, where they're actually seeing what all the other kids are doing when they're home alone on Saturday night?
I often engage in that thought experiment to wonder, what would it have been like during my high school years to have access to social media? And it would have been very bad, I believe, for my life. And I just look at my children and I appreciate that they seem to be navigating it well, that they seem to take it in stride, in spite of the fact that we are wired. I love the fact that you mentioned the fact that this does not make us bad. This is how we are built, period. And it doesn't define us. I think about also, just to use an example of what we're talking about here, I remember this conversation I had with my mom back when I was quite young. And I was envious because somebody in my circle was doing all of these amazing things for society and actually for the world, quite frankly. And I said, well, he only does it to make himself feel better. And my mother just looked at me and said, who cares? He's doing good things. Mm-hmm. And I thought to myself, okay, that's actually the truth. And we can get very simplistic by saying, oh, the only reason Adam created this podcast was to feel better about himself. Sure, that is definitely on the pie chart, and hopefully less and less as time goes by. But one of the things that your book seems to be also addressing is that we're not going to become complacent guys from I don't know if you've ever seen The Big Lebowski. We're not going to become the dude and just sit around and not pay our rent and get evicted and things like that by appreciating our ordinary, that we paradoxically may actually be able to do more, but at the very least, we'll be able to sit in great appreciation of the fact that we're living, the fact that we have some things that we might overlook. And two of my axioms are, what we appreciate appreciates. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, from, I believe, the Bible, it says, or from one of the Proverbs, it says, who is rich? He who appreciates what he has. And I feel like that's really at the heart of your book.
Yeah, that is absolutely there. And interestingly, when we focus on connection, when we focus on engagement, we naturally have more gratitude, because everything's not being evaluated as success or failure. I'm good or I'm not good. And we start to appreciate the little things. We start to appreciate, the sunrise. We start to appreciate a simple interaction with the clerk in a store because we're actually interested in connecting. And paradoxically, we are free to achieve more because we're less afraid of failing. So we experiment more. Good things come of this. We don't imagine it. We're afraid, we'll fall behind, but good things do come of it. And, there are two reasons. I think this is important to mention why putting our eggs in the basket of trying to feel good about ourselves is really doomed to make us miserable. One of them is what we might call narcissistic or self-esteem recalibration. If we think of our lives, you can think of yours, I can think of mine. Think of the different developmental steps we had and how good we felt about ourselves at the different phases. Oh, I figured out how to put multicolored concentrically sized donuts on a pole, right? Those plastic.
I remember
Irwin things, and I got it, and it looks like a cone. How cool, right? So that worked for a while. Or, hey, I can walk, or I rode my bike to the store myself, or graduated elementary school, high school, had a first girlfriend or boyfriend. So many things. I sometimes, teach groups of psychotherapists, and I'll say, now everybody worked really hard here to get a terminal degree and probably a professional license. And I'll ask the audience, how many of you woke up this morning feeling really good about yourself because you have your professional license? And sometimes one newly minted psychotherapist raises their hand and says, why is everybody laughing? Right? Because, it's not working for people anymore. We habituate to whatever it is. Think of how much money you're earning now. Think of how much money you earned in your first job. Your first job, it was fantastic. They're actually paying me to do something. Now I feel inadequate because the guy next door, the woman next door is getting more. We're constantly recalibrating. So even if we're quite successful, my rocket went up higher than your rocket, to use recent examples, right?
Right.
Going into space, right?
Yes.
And on top of that, everything that goes up comes down. Let's say you're really at the top of your game. You're a gold medal Olympic athlete. What are the chances of winning the gold in 4 years? Some. 8 years, not much. 12 years, unlikely. I don't want to be a downer for the audience, but the scenes that you see in a nursing home, and there's somebody in a wheelchair kind of drooling, and oh yeah, she used to be a well-known nuclear physicist.
Right.
I mean, all this stuff, we're not going to hang on to any of it. So is this really what we want to be investing in?
And I know that you really appreciate the impermanence that's described by various Buddhist stories, including when he left the castle to see what happens to some people and what happens to all of us. And it's really something. And the idea of habituating to something that was such a big goal really reduces its value. And that's why I actually do appreciate my license. I'm many years in, and yet I still look at that very happily. And I try to really abide by the axiom of what we appreciate appreciates, because I never want to lose my appreciation of the sweetness and the sacredness of that license that was so hard earned, and what it represents, not only to opening the doors of my life, but as a comparison to my former life in the corporate sphere, which was far less gratifying. But I also realize that, like a thermostat, many things I fail to recognize as totally amazing, like the hot water that comes out of my shower in the morning. That's unbelievable. I have clean hot water. That's just totally remarkable.
I often reflect on this, that, what the monarchs of old would have given for central heating, hygiene, and antibiotics. So you didn't always die from an infection and just walk into a supermarket in the developed world. Staggering variety of fresh foods. They couldn't have imagined it. But many of us go into the supermarket and we think, oh God, there's a line, or it's crowded.
Exactly. Rather than focus on, wow, look at this abundance.
Yeah.
So what are some of the practices that you would encourage my listeners to consider adopting to appreciate the ordinary?
I don't know if we have time for this. It's maybe about a 5-minute exercise.
Do it.
So let's just I'll leave my eyes open so I can read this, but close your eyes. And I invite our listeners, if you're not in the car, to close your eyes and just take a breath or two and settle in so that you can feel what's happening in your body. Because what I'm going to do is just review a number of areas that people get hooked on and start to use as their criteria to feel good about themselves or not good about themselves. And I want you to just notice which, if any of these, rings a bell. Which one feels salient? What feels like, oh yeah, this has mattered to me in my life? Just so you can take a survey of where you might be hooked. So we're going to start with skills and talents. And sometimes these are just feelings about ourselves, and sometimes we compare ourselves to others. So it could be, am I smart enough? Who's smarter? Or am I educated enough? Who's more educated? Am I creative enough? Who's more creative? Have any of these ever kind of gripped you? Do I have good taste, good aesthetic judgment? Or am I good enough at sports? We certainly talked about this. Who's better than me? And then accomplishments. You ever have feelings about earning enough money and who earns more money? Or getting enough respect and who gets more respect? You happen to be a parent. Who has the better looking, better behaved, or more successful children? Are my kids doing well enough? If you happen to have a partner, who has the better looking, better behaved, or more successful partner? Is my partner good enough? Am I successful enough at work? How do I compare to others who are doing this work? And then there's group membership. Do I come from a good enough family? Did I go to a good college? Or who has more friends, is more popular? Am I popular enough? Am I part of the in crowd? Who gets more attention? Do people pay enough attention to me? Or how do I feel about my race, my ethnicity, my gender, my sexual orientation? Do I feel proud and good about these? Do I feel ashamed or embarrassed about any of these? And then how am I in relationships? Am I a good enough friend? Good enough parent? How have I been as a child? Have I been a good enough kid or a good enough sibling? Am I a good coworker? Are other people better to one another? And closely related are our values. Am I nice enough? Am I honest enough? Am I as generous as I should be? Or as caring as I should be? Am I forgiving enough? Am I sufficiently socially aware? Am I attuned to injustices and others' pain? Are others more attuned than me? And of course, physical qualities. Am I good looking enough? Who's thinner? Am I thin enough? Who's taller? Am I tall enough? Am I sexy? Do I look young? Young enough? Or who's stronger and better shape? Am I fit enough? And among those of us interested in spiritual or psychological development, this can get even more absurd. Who's more enlightened? Who's less hooked on social comparison? Who's less driven by ego? Who cares less about self-esteem? Am I too preoccupied with myself? So assuming that at least one of these had some salience for you, rang a bell, take a moment to remember a time that you felt really good about this dimension. Like if it's intelligence, where you felt really smart, or if it was good looking, where you felt like you looked really good. And remember what that felt like and kind of feel it in your body and even exaggerate a little bit that feeling of, pride and being on top or being good enough or being great. And just feel that for a moment. Enjoy it because it's unfortunately not going to last. And then either imagine or remember the opposite, where you felt like on that very same dimension, you weren't cutting it. You'd blown it. You weren't that smart. You looked bad. You were a bad person, whatever it is. And feel that kind of collapse feeling and exaggerate that a little bit just to really see what it feels like. And don't worry, because that won't last either. And then you can just come back to a kind of more neutral posture and take a breath or two and feel what it's like to not be a winner or a loser, to not be good or bad. And then you can open your eyes again. And I'm curious, Adam, if you don't mind sharing, since we can't hear from our listeners, what did you notice?
First of all, I think there's a universality to those questions. I can't imagine anyone who hasn't gone through a question that's on that list for whom, the data is applicable, such as being a parent. If obviously, if a person's not a parent, a series of other questions may emerge. But it is so freeing to go to stage 3, stage 1 of just being in that place of assessing and asking and kind of vacillating between the binary question, am I good or bad? Am I marriageable? Am I not? Am I attractive? Am I not? Am I smart or am I not? It brings on so much pain. And yes, the temporary dopamine hit of just really feeling the cockiness of like a win. And then I, of course, think about the impermanence, that Buddhism teaches. And even in the Torah, where King Solomon had a ring that said, this too shall pass. And the impermanence of things. And then going into stage 3, I'm just calling it stage 3 because when you just allowed me to just be mindful to who I was, where I was, being here now, kind of to borrow from Ram Dass's famous phrase, the third was infinitely superior to any of that. Mm-hmm. Just being with what is and not resisting. I love how you also, and I think about that idea of, pain times resistance equals suffering. And I think that either of the other two, the former two, the vacillations of doing the binary questions, as well as the momentary win, which has a hollow victory at the end on average. Boy, what a difference. I love stage 3.
Yeah. And by the way I came up with this list was thinking of the things I've gotten hooked on throughout my life. And it's only a partial list, but it is interesting how universal these are. I mean, we're all different, right? Each one of us, one or another is going to be more like our go-to thing to worry about. But what we all have in common is something or another on the list is relevant to us.
And, I'm taking great interest in listening to the biographies and interviews with really famous people who have achieved a lot. And invariably, they have said what you said about the license versus the newly licensed person. And that is, yeah, they habituate and they revert back to baseline and they are there's something so anticlimactic about that victory and recognizing, oh my gosh, I'm still me.
Yeah. And if me as an ordinary human being going through this life cycle, but holding hands with and connected to other ordinary human beings, if that's what we're going for, well, that's sustainable. I mean, we're going to grow old and die anyway, but at least throughout the life cycle, that can be relatively sustained. Whereas being on top, because we're going to recalibrate and because we're not always what goes up is going to come down, is going to leave us always, always stressed and struggling, trying desperately to get back the good feeling and ward off the bad.
I love that. And I think about the concept of the I and thou and how holy it is to transcend and connect with another. And that does seem on some level to be one of the peak experiences of human existence. It's not necessarily winning the gold. It's the connection with self, connection with others. That really seems to matter. Is that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's connection, it's engagement, gratitude, generosity flows from this. And it's the things that the world's wisdom traditions have pointed to for millennia. And, modern science says they were right about this. And then when we examine it currently this way in our current cultural context, one of the problems with our current cultural context is there are so few of these messages moving us toward connection, engagement, humility, and so many messages suggesting, if only you could be in the elite group, you'd be happy. I love it. You'd be at the gate and it's like, we're going to start with the first class passengers. Okay. They paid a lot for the ticket. Go ahead. Then military folks. Okay. They're serving our country. Then the people with strollers. All right. Makes sense. Hard to get on the plane. And then we start with the executive platinum plus.
The better people.
Right. Followed by the platinum, by the gold, and then the silver. And God forbid you should be one of the 8 proletariat.
I've definitely been in Group C.
Right.
It's just like, we pick up the dregs. Yes. Like, oh gosh, another middle seat between.
We're selling this stuff. This stuff is being, buy this car and people will like you and you will feel successful. There's just endless messaging about this. And given that we've got all this hard wiring predisposing us to this, boy, we get caught in it.
And sure do.
Yet it doesn't make us very happy. And nor does it help us get along with one another.
One of the videos that really was so edifying for me is you see 2 monkeys being fed side by side in separate cages, but they can see each other. They're both being fed cucumbers, which they like at around a 3 to a 5 out of 10. And then one of the monkeys, instead of getting the cucumbers, starts getting grapes, which is like a 10 out of 10. It's like lobster. And the other monkey who can see is still getting the cucumbers and immediately sees the disparity and the social comparison and begins to throw the cucumbers back while the other is receiving. And I think about keeping up with the Joneses, the old axiom, but now we're trying to keep up with the Kardashians, which is much harder. The Joneses would be the delta between us, me and the Joneses, not that much, but between me and the Kardashians, quite severe.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it is terribly painful.
Terribly painful. This has been so much fun. My final question, which I often ask, is a magical one. It's actually fantastical. If you had the powers to confer upon all humanity, one skill or insight that would positively affect them, how do you imagine that skill or insight would help the individual and perhaps even society at large?
At this moment, with this theme, what comes to mind, it sounds trite, but it's like, Mr. Rogers, you're okay, sweetheart. You're okay, sweetheart. Because it's that fundamental sense that you're okay in a way which isn't about good or bad, winning or losing, your performance or even your ethics of the moment, or, to just be able to rest in that a little bit, which isn't about being extraordinary at all. It's about being okay in a very ordinary way. But wouldn't that be nice? So you could just enjoy the engagement of today. And you know what? You're likely to be a nicer human being to others because you're not going to be judging them so much. You're going to be appreciating their fundamental okayness also. I know it sounds terribly unsophisticated, but that's what I would wish.
So often the unsophisticated is actually very hard to do in real time. And I think this is a great prescription. I think it could actually be a great salve for that thing called envy that we all experience. And even for our judgments for being envious, like as if we're not going to be envious. Of course we will.
Right.
Well, I highly recommend listeners that you pick up Ron's book, which he was warned not to write. And I'm so glad he did not follow that advice and that you wrote this book and gave it as a gift of your heart and your time, of course, to yourself, but not mutually exclusive to the reader. And I can say, as a beneficiary of your writing, it's been a huge gift and couldn't recommend it more highly. And I'm so grateful for you for sharing.
I'm glad. And just in the interest, I did have this insight. One of the fruits of writing the book was I had this thought once I was taking a walk, and I thought, I just hope it'll be useful to somebody. And I actually felt that it wasn't like, what are the Amazon rankings going to be? It was really, I hope it'll be useful to somebody. So in the spirit of that, please give people a way to link to it in some way.
Of course. I do believe it will be of great use. And thanks again for sharing with us your time.
Thank you for sharing your time and your thoughtful look at the subject.
Absolutely. It's been great. This is Dr. Adam Dorsey thanking you for listening to Super Psyched. If you know anyone who might like it or who might benefit from listening, share it. And if you like the episode, please hit subscribe